Iris Marion Young, 1949–2006, was a political theorist whose work reshaped debates about justice, democracy, and feminism. Her book, Justice and the Politics of Difference, is widely regarded as her most influential work. Published in 1990, it challenges dominant liberal theories of justice, especially those emphasizing impartiality and distributive equality in the abstract, and replaces them with a framework that centers structural oppression, group difference, and democratic inclusion. Young's aim was not only theoretical, but also political, to provide a conceptual foundation for movements that challenge systemic racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression. She sought to expand the scope of justice beyond the distribution of goods to include social relations, institutional structures, and cultural recognition. Young begins by critically engaging with thinkers like John Rawls and his theory of justice, which conceives justice as fairness achieved through impartial, universal principles. While acknowledging the achievements of such theories, she argues that they are insufficient for addressing real-world inequalities. Her main critique is that abstract universalism tends to obscure power relations and structural inequalities. By imagining that justice requires treating everyone the same, liberal theory neglects the ways in which different social groups are positioned unequally in economic, political, and cultural systems. This can lead to policies that claim neutrality but in practice perpetuate oppression. Number 3, justice as more than distribution. One of Young's most important conceptual moves is redefining justice. Instead of viewing it purely in terms of distribution, of goods, rights, opportunities, she argues for a relational and structural account. Justice must examine the social processes, institutions, and cultural norms that shape people's lives and opportunities. This broader understanding allows her to identify injustices that distributive models miss, such as cultural domination, political marginalization, and systemic violence. It also shifts attention from merely compensating disadvantaged individuals toward transforming the structures that produce disadvantage in the first place. 4. The 5 Faces of Oppression. Young's most famous conceptual framework is the 5 Faces of Oppression. This model identifies distinct but interconnected forms of structural injustice. 1. Exploitation. The unfair transfer of the results of one group's labor to benefit another. This is central in capitalist economies, where marginalized workers generate wealth they cannot access. 2. Marginalization. The exclusion of entire groups from participation in social life, such as when disabled people, racial minorities, or the elderly are systematically pushed out of the labor market and civic participation. 3. Powerlessness. The inability to participate meaningfully in decision-making processes that affect one's life. This includes lacking authority, autonomy, or voice in political or workplace contexts. 4. Cultural imperialism. The universalization of a dominant group's culture, values, and experiences as normal, rendering other cultures invisible, devalued, or stereotyped. 5. Violence. Systematic physical or psychological harm directed at members of a group simply because they belong to that group, often tolerated or ignored by institutions. This framework emphasizes that oppression is structural, embedded in institutions and norms, not merely the result of individual prejudice or malice. It also makes clear that different groups may experience oppression in different combinations, requiring a politics that recognizes group difference. Number 5. The politics of difference. A. Rejecting assimilationist ideals. In liberal thought, justice often requires that citizens shed particular group identities in favor of a shared, universal political identity. Young critiques this as assimilationist, pressuring marginalized groups to conform to dominant norms. This approach not only erases valuable cultural differences, but also hides the power dynamics that determine which norms are considered neutral. B. Difference as a resource for Young. Difference should be understood as a political resource, not a barrier. Diverse experiences and perspectives enrich democratic discourse, offering insights that dominant groups cannot see from their standpoint. A politics of difference encourages institutional structures that allow diverse voices to shape collective decisions. C. Group differentiated policies. Because oppression operates through group-based structures, Young supports group differentiated rights and policies, for example, affirmative action, minority language rights, or culturally specific public services. Such measures are not forms of unfair, special treatment, but necessary tools for dismantling systemic inequality. 6. Impartiality and the myth of neutrality. Young devotes considerable attention to the liberal ideal of impartiality, the notion that justice requires decision-makers to abstract from their particular identities and adopt a universal standpoint. She argues that this is a myth. No one can transcend their social position, and attempts to do so often reinforce the perspective of the dominant group, disguised as neutrality. Instead of striving for impossible impartiality, Young calls for inclusive deliberation in which all social groups are represented and empowered to express their perspectives. This requires institutional reforms that amplify marginalized voices rather than silence them. 7. The social connection model of responsibility. In later chapters, Young addresses the question of responsibility for structural injustice. Traditional moral and legal frameworks focus on liability, finding individuals who are at fault, and holding them accountable for past actions. Young argues that this model is inadequate for structural injustices, which are the result of countless small actions by many people, often without malicious intent. Her social connection model shifts the focus. Responsibility is shared by all who contribute to and benefit from unjust structures. It is forward-looking, emphasizing action to change unjust systems rather than punishment for past wrongs. It calls for collective action, since no individual can dismantle structural injustice alone. This model fosters a sense of moral obligation even in those who have not directly harmed others but whose everyday activities sustain systems of inequality. Application to feminism and gender. In her discussion of gender as seriality, Young borrows from Jean-Paul Sartre to describe women as a series, a category whose members share a structural position rather than a single essence or collective will. This allows her to avoid essentialist accounts of womanhood while still recognizing that women face common forms of oppression. This perspective aligns with her politics of difference. Gender justice must recognize that women's experiences vary dramatically across race, class, sexuality, and other axes, yet they are similarly positioned within broader patriarchal structures. Democratic theory and inclusion. Young's vision of democracy is deeply participatory and pluralistic. She insists that democracy must include all affected social groups in decision-making, facilitate communicative democracy, where people can speak from their own social positions without pressure to adopt dominant norms, provide institutional supports, such as translation services, flexible meeting times, and quotas, that enable marginalized groups to participate fully. Her democratic theory rejects both technocratic elitism and majoritarian dominance, aiming instead for a system where power is genuinely shared. Number 10. Criticisms and debates. While justice and the politics of difference has been celebrated for expanding the concept of justice, it has also faced criticism. Some liberals argue that group-differentiated rights risk fragmenting the political community and undermining solidarity. Others worry that emphasizing group identity could entrench divisions or essentialize differences. Marxist critics sometimes claim that her focus on cultural and political dimensions of oppression underplays the centrality of economic exploitation. Young responds that these criticisms misunderstand her position. Acknowledging group difference is not about freezing identities, but about dismantling the structures that give them political salience. Number 11. Legacy and influence. Young's work has profoundly influenced feminist theory, especially intersectional approaches that link multiple forms of oppression, multicultural political theory supporting minority rights and cultural recognition, critical race theory in its emphasis on structural and institutional racism, global justice debates, particularly through her social connection model, which has been applied to issues like climate change, sweatshop labor, and global inequality. Her framework continues to inform activism, from indigenous sovereignty movements to disability rights campaigns, because it offers both a diagnosis of oppression and a strategy for justice. Conclusion. Justice and the politics of difference redefines what justice means in a complex, pluralistic society. By moving beyond distribution to focus on structural oppression, by rejecting the myth of neutrality, And by embracing a politics that values difference as a democratic resource, Iris Marion Young provides tools for building a more inclusive, participatory, and just society. Her insistence that justice must address the relations and processes that shape people's lives, not just the goods they possess, remains a powerful corrective to narrow liberal frameworks. In a world still marked by deep structural inequalities, her call for group-differentiated inclusion and shared responsibility continues to resonate. I can also prepare a condensed one-page summary of this book alongside this 1,200-word version, so you'd have both a detailed and a quick reference.